She's like a sickness in my brain, a vision standing by the window pane. She ripples through the blinds and leaves me in a daze. It's in the way her body moves me, the way she grabs me and intoxicates, until the signals in my mind forget to operate. In a fragile skull, I take my pleasure from my alcohol. She'll never give you any time at all. She just comes and goes, you know. And she's got me living in a chemical love, and I try to find the strength to know when she comes back to me again. I'm gonna come up from my hiding.
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another coffee and crime time. And I am ready. I am thoroughly agitated. It's a couple of days after Christmas. My hair hasn't been washed in far too long, as you can probably see from the limp and oily way it is hanging here. I haven't been to the gym in almost 2 weeks because of all the Christmas hullabaloo. My house literally looks like a bomb went off in every single room, and I'm not one of those people who says like, oh, looks like a bomb went off in my house, and you know, there's just like a piece of wrapping paper sitting in the middle of the living room. It legitimately looks like somebody came in my house and threw a grenade into every room, and it is just trashed. Okay, my whole routine is thrown off, so I'm feeling very like, you know, raw, exposed nerve. And so I'm ready to talk about this. And actually, I was going to record this video the day before Christmas Eve because that's when I watched this episode of the Casey Anthony Peacock series. That's when I watched it, and I was so pissed that I said, it's not going to be productive if I sit down and record this video right now. Give it a couple of days, step away from it, because otherwise I'm just going to rage into the camera for an hour. I was so angry. I was livid. I was literally screaming at my computer the day before Christmas Eve. And I said, no, I don't deserve this. You guys don't deserve this. We deserve to have a nice holiday season and not have this agitation of listening to this idiot woman, Casey Anthony, talk and talk and talk and lie and lie and lie, allegedly. That's what I think she's doing. Don't come for me. So here we are back by popular demand to talk about episode 2 in the Casey Anthony Peacock somber reality television series. I will not call it a documentary. There's nothing, you know, I mean, documentaries these days are always biased and one-sided and always are like giving you a narrative anyways. So I guess like if that's what documentaries have become, that's very sad. But this one specifically, I'm not going to call it a docu-series or a documentary. It's a reality show because it's just very, very one-sided. And this episode is aptly titled Remembering. And why is that an apt title? Because it's vague and broad and pointless, much like this entire series. And it might as well be titled Creating, because Casey Anthony doesn't remember things. She makes things up using the kernel of truth method that we talked about and discussed in episode 1, or in the video where we talked about episode 1. So I did some digging and I found out that the director of this docu-series, her name is Alexandra Dean, and she claims that, quote, so far, everyone had heard one side of the story, so of course they believe that's the only truth, and the outrage is understandable. I think when they watch the documentary and they hear the other side of the story, they'll realize there are a lot of questions that haven't been answered. End quote. What is this? That's the only truth. There is only one truth, despite what some people may believe. There's not like your truth and my truth. There's the truth. There's what actually happened. When you're talking about a life that's lost, there is the truth, okay? So what is that truth? And there are certainly a lot of questions that haven't been answered, truthfully. But the fact that this woman, Alexandria Dean, who claims to be a professional documentary filmmaker, states that only one side of the story has been told, it makes me physically ill. I am genuinely angry that people can just say whatever they want, and as long as they say it with enough confidence, no one calls them on it. But I am calling you on it, Casey. I am calling you on it, Alexandra Dean. The problem is, if you cared to know multiple angles of this case, the documentation is out there to read and look through. The whole, only one side of the story has been told thing is ludicrous. There's cell phone records, there's internet search histories, there's timelines, there's conversations, surveillance footage, police reports, the entire trial that's on YouTube, and several different books all written from different perspectives. Okay, you've got Jeff Ashton, who is the prosecutor on the case. He wrote a book. You've got Jose Baez, who was Casey's defense attorney, who wrote a book. And do you think that Jose Baez wrote the book talking shit about Casey or not telling her side of the story? Of course not. He told her side of the story. There is no way that only one side of this story has been told. But Casey never even had one story, right? And therein lies the issue. Her side of the story has been told so many times, but it's also changed so many times that it is literally unrecognizable. She's told her sides of the story, but no one believes her because she's a liar. So what Alexandria Dean meant to say is, please watch our docu-series / reality television show where we pick and choose what evidence you see because that's what supports our side of the story, and then change your mind based on a bunch of haphazard copy and paste allegations, exaggerations, dramatizations, and at times outright falsehoods. But let's hit play. Let's hit play and see what Casey has to say anyways. But before we do, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. Does listening to Casey Anthony make you feel unsafe? Me too. But at least I know I can be safe on the internet with Surfshark VPN. Surfshark secures your data with industry-leading measures by using uncrackable encryption in the most secure VPN protocols. Surfshark also provides IP and DNS leak protection so that nobody can find out where you're connecting from, and they maintain a strict no-logs policy, which means they never store or save what you're doing on the internet, which a lot of internet providers actually do because they want to sell your data. And all of that sounds complicated, and you might think, you aren't tech savvy enough to even know where to start. And that's honestly how I felt because I'm not tech savvy enough for anything, really. But Surfshark is so easy to use, and if I can say that, it's true, because literally, technology is not easy for me ever. It is a trial and tribulation every single time. With Surfshark VPN, you just have to install and run it, and then Surfshark will connect to the server that offers you the best speeds by default. And Surfshark VPN is jam-packed with features that go way beyond the basics. These features allow you to not only protect yourself and your personal information, but there are a lot of other benefits, like having access to entertainment you might not otherwise have. For instance, a few of my viewers from the UK said they wanted to watch this Casey Anthony series, but they don't have Peacock in the UK. Well, if you use Surfshark VPN, you can change your location to make it look like you're watching from the States, and then you have access to everything that we do here. With Surfshark VPN, you can also unlock 15 of the largest Netflix country libraries, including the US and Japan, and Surfshark has now reached coverage in 100 countries, which is huge. Best of all, and my favorite feature, is that one Surfshark VPN subscription allows you to install and run Surfshark on an unlimited number of devices. This is big for me because I want to see my kids and my family protected, and even as my parents get older, I don't want to see them scanned by internet con artists, the Nigerian princes of the world. So I can put Surfshark VPN on my mom's computer, her phone, my husband's phone, my husband's computer, my kids' tablets, their phones, even their gaming systems. Because Surfshark VPN has apps for multiple platforms, including PlayStation and Xbox. So if you have a gamer, especially a young gamer in your house like I do, and you want to keep this, person safe, Surfshark VPN can do that. And 24/7 customer support will ensure that you never run into a problem with Surfshark that you have to muddle through alone. They are always there to help, and they get you back on track quickly with a friendly attitude. You have nothing to lose. You should definitely try Surfshark VPN for yourself. And if you find that it's not for you, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, which gives you plenty of time to try Surfshark out risk-free. Right now, for a limited time, you can get 85% off a 2-year plan plus 3 extra months for free. All you have to do is go to surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe. This special offer makes your subscription just $1.97 a month, so you can browse securely on all of your devices. Once again, go to surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe for 85% off a 2-year plan plus 3 extra months for free. Thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. And let's get back into it. Okay, first I want to talk about something I found out since making my video on episode 1. And that is, no matter how old you are, no matter how much wisdom you have, how much money you have, how successful you are, how much shit you've seen go down in your life, you can still be an idiot. At the beginning of this month, Rosie O'Donnell took to social media and said that after watching this docu-series, which she also claimed was one of the best documentaries she's ever seen, she now believes that Casey Anthony is innocent. It's unfortunate that even grown-ass adults will view a clearly biased piece of content and then allow this clearly biased one-sided piece of content to sway their opinion without doing any further, research or digging on their own. And maybe Rosie does know the basics of this case, probably just what she's seen from other pieces of content, other documentaries, things like that. But it is very clear to me, abundantly clear, crystal clear, that she did not do her own research. And if you aren't going to do that, if you aren't going to take it upon yourself to learn everything you can about the death of a child, then you have no business speaking on who you think is innocent or guilty in regards to the death of that child. You have no business talking about it. As a person with an audience, giving your opinion, not only that Casey is innocent, which, now that I say it out loud, is a hilarious sentence to string together, but that George Anthony killed his granddaughter. That is so irresponsible. If you're going to make a statement like that, you better have done your homework, not just watched a fake so-called documentary series. You better know that case inside and out. And she clearly does not. Like, how could you even say that's the best documentary you've ever watched? It is so garbage. It's so trash. In general, I don't like a ton of true crime documentaries because they usually are biased and they're usually trying to tell one story, like the Madeleine McCann one and the Adnan Syed one. There's so many, and they always tell one side of the story, but like there are a million better documentaries and docuseries than this one. So you A, don't watch a lot of documentaries, or B, you were paid to say this? I don't know. Let us know, Rosie, if you're watching, which one it is. Is it A or B? Column A or column B? I can't even stand that she felt compelled to say this out loud. Like, you're allowed to have whatever thoughts you want in your head, and you're allowed to give your opinion on these cases. It's what I do, but I don't give my opinion on these cases without finding every possible thing out there to read and research about them. I just don't, and it's not even in an effort to be irresponsible. I don't want to be irresponsible, but for me, it's just I'm interested. I want to know, and I have to know everything before I form an opinion. And I can't believe that she just watched this garbage and then she was like, let me go live and let me tweet out that I think Casey is innocent and that I think George Anthony did it. Because that's what she said. All right, let's jump into episode 2. So in the first few minutes of this episode, we get a couple of clips from November of 2008 after it was discovered that Kaylee was missing and everyone was searching for her. And I'm really glad that this happened because one of these clips shows Casey in jail talking to her parents, George and Cindy Anthony. And Cindy Anthony says, "Hey, Casey, everyone's out there looking for Kaylee. Do you think we're going to find her?" And Casey responds, "I don't know, Mom. I hope so." At this point, she's sitting across from both of her parents, Cindy and George. The only thing that separates them is this plexiglass divider. And she doesn't lock eyes with her father or exchange a meaningful look with him as if to say, "Are you going to tell her or am I?" She doesn't make any indication that she and George share this very serious secret about what truly happened to Kaylee. Now, Kaylee's body has not been found yet by this point at the time this conversation is happening. Casey was still telling everyone the Zanny the Nanny story. And she's still pretending as if there's a chance all of these people spending their time and their energy searching for her daughter, they might have some hope of finding her. Well, why not tell the truth now? Why not tell your mother that the person she needs to ask about the location of little Kaylee is sitting right next to her, sleeping next to her in bed every night? Why keep this charade going at this point when you are the person in the hot seat? You're the one sitting behind bars because everyone in the world believes you're responsible for your daughter's disappearance and potential death, and you're literally facing either a life sentence or the death penalty. Why wouldn't you say something now. If not now, when? I guess a decade later, but okay. Like, were you gonna wait until you were found guilty to bring this up? Because then it would be too late. Okay, it would be too late then. I was hoping that after they showed this clip, Casey would come on screen and answer that question. She would explain herself. She would say, I should have told my mom then, or I should have told the police, or I should have told someone at some point. Even if I wasn't doing it, in a jailhouse conversation, I should have told somebody. So I hope she would come on screen and explain herself. And she does come on screen, but not to answer that question.
I believed that she was still okay. So I know you want to ask me about the last day she was here, the last day that I saw her, the day she disappeared. I know that's what it's all leading up to. I can tell you about what I remember from that morning. It's not much.
So right off the bat, once again, on a very surface level, Casey seems convincing. And if I was watching a Lifetime movie, I would say, hey, this is really good acting. But I'm not. I'm not watching a Lifetime movie. I'm watching someone who's on a so-called documentary who is so upset that they are crying in front of a camera, but also so self-aware and concerned with how they look to this camera, that even the crying is strategic. The wiping away of tears is strategic, dabbing at them instead of actually swiping, so as not to disturb the makeup too much. Casey said she'll tell us what happened on that fateful June morning. She'll tell us what she remembers, but it's not much. Before we hear what she has to say, let's go back and see what her previous story was, what she has previously claimed happened that morning, the story that she and her legal team dropped on everyone during her trial. During the trial, the prosecution claimed that Caylee Anthony had died from 3 pieces of duct tape that had been placed around her head, covering her nose and her mouth. And the defense claimed that Caylee had died from an accidental drowning in the family pool, which George Anthony then helped to cover up. Casey's lawyer, Jose Baez, told the jury that Caylee had been swimming with her grandmother, Cindy, for much of the previous day, June 15th. And when they were done swimming, Cindy forgot to put the ladder up, which was something the family always made sure to do so that little Caylee couldn't climb into the swimming pool herself while she was alone, because she can't swim on her own because she's only 2. But because Cindy had failed to put up the ladder, Caylee did climb up the next day, June 16th. She slipped into the pool and she drowned. Jose Baez said, quote, "Casey should have called 911. That's what she's guilty of. She's not guilty of murder. This is not a murder case." End quote. Jose Baez explained why duct tape was found on Caylee's remains by saying that it was George Anthony who planted the tape there, hoping to implicate his daughter, Casey. Baez said, quote, "George Anthony took certain steps to make sure he was as far away from the situation and that Casey would end up taking the blame for this." End quote. Let's examine that. And let's say that the duct tape on Caylee's remains was planted there. Now, are we supposed to believe that George Anthony is the one who planted it there, when he would act completely ignorant as to where Caylee was in the 31 days she was missing? Or do we think it's more likely that Casey planted the duct tape there because she knew that she was going to try to hold everyone off for as long as possible by saying that Caylee was with a nanny and Caylee was having the time of her life and having so much fun, but that if Caylee's remains were ever discovered, Casey would just say that the nanny had kidnapped her and the duct tape over the little girl's nose and mouth would add up. That is something that kidnappers do, right? Something that abductors do. We all have seen it in the movies. So who's more likely to have planted the duct tape? George Anthony, who literally said, I don't know, I saw Caylee drive away with Casey, and then I don't know what happened to her. Or Casey, who lied to everyone for 31 days so that nobody would look for Caylee, so that her remains would be decomposed enough so that nobody could figure out what happened to her or how she died. And Casey, who was the one saying that Caylee was kidnapped, and then Caylee's found with the duct tape over her mouth as if she'd been kidnapped. Who's more likely to have planted the duct tape? Jose Baez also claimed during the trial that Casey didn't tell anyone for 31 days that her daughter was missing, and she insisted for months that Caylee had been taken because Casey had been trained to lie through years of sexual abuse at the hands of her father and brother, a claim which the judge during that trial did not allow any further discussion of, saying, quote, "There's absolutely no evidence the defendant was sexually molested by her father or her brother," end quote. Circuit Judge Belvin Perry Jr., who presided over this trial, has made his opinion clear over the years. He agreed with the Florida Department of Children and Families, who concluded that Kaylee was responsible for her daughter's death because of her actions or lack of actions, which ultimately led to and resulted in Kaylee no longer being alive. Judge Perry believed that Kaylee may have accidentally killed Kaylee while she was using chloroform on her in order to calm the child. Regardless, the judge of this trial says, "I don't believe these claims about Kaylee being molested, and I definitely think Kaylee had something to do with her daughter's death, whether it was accidental or purposeful." The fact of the matter is, what you won't hear in this series is that Kaylee was found guilty or of being responsible for her child's death by Florida's DCF, the Department of Children and Families. She was found to have been responsible, basically in like a civil way. And they won't tell you that. I mean, I haven't watched episode 3 yet. I don't know if they do tell you that, but I have a strong feeling they don't, right? Because they don't tell you a lot of things. They tell you certain bits and pieces of evidence, strategically bits and pieces of evidence that could be construed two ways, but all of the evidence that definitely looks bad for Kaylee, they just conveniently leave out, or I mean, maybe, it got taken out on the cutting room floor because these episodes are long enough as it is, but instead of actual evidence that makes Kaylee look guilty, we've got shots of Kaylee strolling along, in like a swamp, taking pictures. We've got, video footage of Kaylee crying over and over and saying the same thing over and over. So there definitely was time to talk about the evidence that made Kaylee look bad. They just didn't want to. Right? They just didn't want to. And I'm sorry, but I do think that the judge who presided over this trial, who saw Kaylee not just when the jury was in the room, not just when the cameras were running, who saw her the whole time, and who listened to every bit of evidence and who listened to every expert and who probably knows a lot of behind-the-scenes stories, we should take his opinion into account. And he thinks Kaylee's responsible one way or the other. Now, the story that Kaylee told during her trial in 2011 was that on June 16th, 2008, she was jolted awake by her father, George, who was yelling, "Where's Kaylee? Where's Kaylee?" According to Kaylee usually slept in bed with her, and this was something she did to protect her child from the predator that she knew George Anthony was. Now, why Kaylee allowed herself and her daughter to continue living in the Anthony home with George, a man who allegedly had raped his own daughter at the age of 8, a man who certainly shouldn't be trusted around children, who knows? We don't have that answer either. Why, Kaylee? Why did you stay there? Why did you stay there with your young daughter when you knew what your father had done to you? And this is another thing that bugs the shit out of me. Kaylee will sometimes say like, "Oh, well, I didn't remember all of this. Like, I didn't remember the abuse. I didn't remember what he had done to me." And it all came rushing back to me at different times. Depending on when she's telling the story and who she's talking to, it all came rushing back to her at different times. During this series, Kaylee, I think, gives like 3 different explanations for when it all came rushing back to her. Just during the 2 episodes I've watched. Actually, I didn't start to watch episode 3 yet. So just during the 2 episodes that I've watched, Kaylee says that it all came rushing back to her when she started going to therapy. She also says it all came rushing back to her when she was in prison. And then she says it all came rushing back to her when this woman, a trauma expert, was on the stand during her 2011 trial. So when did she remember the abuse? According to her, it all came rushing back to her at one time or another. However, she also says that she had Kaylee sleep in bed with her to protect her from her father. So it doesn't sound like it all came rushing back to you. It sounds like you always knew and you always remembered. So if that's the case, then why did you let your daughter live there? Why did you always leave your daughter in the care of your parents to go out and hang out with your friends? Why did you do that if you were so concerned about Kaylee? Now, Kaylee's never going to answer the question of why she would often go out with her friends or pretend to be going to work during the day. And she had no problem leaving Kaylee alone with George and Cindy, or just George, a man who had allegedly raped her and a woman who had potentially known about it and did nothing to stop it. She'll never answer that question. But anyways, going along with Casey's story, Kaylee usually slept with Casey, but not today. So Casey woke up in her bed alone, jolted from her sleep by this screaming. Casey and George started looking around the house for Kaylee, but they couldn't find her. So they went outside, and at that point, Casey noticed that the pool ladder was not pulled up. It was left down. But she doesn't really make too much of this, so she starts to head back inside the house, but then she sees her father carrying Kaylee's wet, limp body, and Casey saw that Kaylee was dead. Now, I'm getting all of this, by the way, from the blog of Peter Goldenbrock, the co-author of Jose Baez's book, Presumed Guilty. Also, this is from testimony and stuff. Also, Casey has said this before. This was her story in 2011. This is what she says happened on that morning. This is what she says in 2011. I just want to very much distinguish what she said then and what she's saying now. This is what she's saying in 2011. So Peter goes on to say in this blog, quote, "When she told the story to her attorney, Jose Baez, tears began running down her face. My father started yelling at me. 'It's all your fault. Look what you've done. You weren't watching her. You're going to go to fucking jail for child neglect. You weren't watching her.' She got out of the house and look what happened." Casey said she cried the whole time her father was yelling at her. In shock, she went inside and lay on her bed. She said her father walked into her room and told her, "I'll take care of her," and he walked away. After George Anthony went to work that afternoon, Casey said he called her on her cell phone and told her, "I took care of everything." She said he wanted her not to tell her mother, end quote. Okay. This is what Casey says in 2011. Casey was asleep that morning. She's woken up by her father yelling, "Where's Kaylee?" Then she sees her daughter's dead body in the arms of her father. He blames her for Kaylee's death, but then tells her he's going to take care of it. But did you hear Casey in that clip that I played earlier say, "I thought she was okay"? Meaning she thought Kaylee was what? Still alive? And then let's look at the internet history from the morning of June 16th, 2008. Because if Casey was woken up by George Anthony looking for Kaylee, she couldn't have been on the internet, right? Because you can't sleep and be on the internet at the same time. Yet, she was. Even in Jose Baez's own book, because I have his book, because I had to read it, and I checked. He talks about how someone in the Anthony home was on Facebook for 2 hours that morning, researching outfits worn by shot girls at clubs. And at that time, Casey was supposedly helping her club promoter boyfriend, Anthony Lazaro, manage a group of shot girls. I mean, I know that George Anthony is action-packed with issues. We all acknowledge that, we all accept it, but is he really researching outfits worn by shot girls? And I guess you could argue, if you're pro Casey, that George Anthony made those internet searches because he was trying to set Casey up to make it look like she was awake and on the internet. But let's be honest about this, okay? This is early on. This is before the 31 days where Casey and Kaylee are missing. At this point, Casey's telling her parents that she's working at Universal Studios. They have no idea that she's been hanging out with her club promoter boyfriend, Anthony Lazaro, or that she's helping him manage these shot girls, because she's not being honest about it. She wants them to think she has this legitimate job that she's going to every day, like an office job. She was an events coordinator. They had no idea she was hanging out at clubs. So why would George Anthony know to do that? Don't see why he would just out of the blue be researching outfits worn by shot girls. But they're not going to tell you about this stuff in the docu-series, the reality show. They're not going to tell you this stuff. They're conveniently going to just avoid talking about anything that discredits Casey's statements then and now. But if you look hard enough, not even hard, it's not hard to find this stuff. I mean, it's not. If you look at all, you'll see that the evidence is out there to disprove what Casey's saying. So from 7:56 a.m. to 8:06 a.m., Casey was on AIM, AOL Instant Messenger, and she was having a conversation with a friend. And at 10:27 a.m., Casey uploaded a photo of the interior of Fusion nightclub. That's where her boyfriend, Anthony Lazaro, was doing promotions. So how early was Casey woken up by her father, George, yelling where's Kaylee? Was she woken up before 7:56 a.m. and she witnessed her father holding her daughter's dead body, and then she just jumped right on the computer and started, researching shot girl outfits and chatting with friends? If not, then when was she woken up? The physical evidence does not support the story she told in 2011, and the blog post written by this co-author of Jose Baez's book was written in 2012. Also, from her phone records, we know that Kaylee did leave the house, like George Anthony stated, around 12:50 p.m., but she didn't leave the area. She just drove around the neighborhood and waited for her father, George, to go to work. She was on the phone with her ex-boyfriend, Jesse Grand, her friend, Amy Hazinga, who she would later steal from. And George Anthony did call Kaylee, right? Just like this blog post said, just like all of these people have been alleging that George Anthony called Kaylee and said, oh, it's done. I took care of it. But listen, the thing that's funny about this is Kaylee didn't answer this call. He called. The phone records show that, but she didn't answer his call. She was on the other line. So when did he tell her that he had taken care of it? If you look at the evidence, the physical evidence, if you look at the cell phone records, you won't find when that call could have taken place. But that's just details. It's neither here nor there. What matters more than evidence, literal evidence that is unbiased, because cell phone records can't be biased. If you look at the actual unbiased evidence, it disproves everything Kaylee's saying, but that's not as important as how she feels and how she remembers it. I'm so pissed. So as we can tell from her cell phone records, Kaylee stayed in the area of her parents' house until 4:18 p.m. So basically she drove around waiting for George Anthony to leave for work, and then she went back to her parents' house and she got back on the internet. And then after, the 4:18 p.m. time, she drove to her boyfriend's house. And then she and Tony Lazaro, they went to Blockbuster and they spent a low-key evening at his apartment without Kaylee. Like you see them on surveillance at Blockbuster, Kaylee's not there. When they get to Anthony Lazaro's apartment, Kaylee's not there because he said she wasn't there. So sometime between when George Anthony saw Kaylee leave the house at 12:50 p.m. and when Kaylee showed up at Tony Lazaro's a little bit, after 4 p.m., Caylee Anthony died. And it's important to remember that the place Kaylee's body was found was just around the corner from the Anthony home. So Kaylee would not have had to have left that area to dispose of the body. So my personal theory on this, I don't know how Kaylee died, but I do believe she died between that 12:50 and 4 p.m. time, whether it was purposeful, whether when Kaylee was driving around waiting for George Anthony to leave, Kaylee was drugged and in the trunk of the car with duct tape over her face and her nose, or if when Kaylee went back home and got on the computer, Kaylee actually did get in the swimming pool and accidentally drown. I don't know how it happened, but I know at that point, between those hours, that's when Caylee Anthony died. Now, what does that mean? Because at the same time, I also don't believe that on that same day, Caylee Anthony disposed of her daughter's body. I think she kept Kaylee's body in her car that night. And I think that it was the next day or the day after, I'm going to clarify in a minute, when she went to her neighbor's house, Brian Berner, I think his name is, and asked for a shovel, to borrow a shovel, because she said something like she had to dig a root out of her lawn, like Caylee Anthony's ever done any lawn work, or like done any work that's helpful or productive around the house. So she told her neighbor, I need this shovel to dig this root out of my yard. But she didn't dig a root out of her yard. There was no root that needed to be dug out of her yard. So what did she need a shovel for? I believe it is at that time that Kaylee disposed of Kaylee's body right around the corner from her parents' house. Now that we know what the physical evidence says and what Kaylee's claims were in 2011, let's see what she has to say now. Like I said, this episode is called Remembering, after all, so maybe she just remembered a completely different version of events. So this is Kaylee's story from the Peacock docu-series.
The night before was a normal night. Got Kaylee to bed. Woke up the next morning, got her breakfast. I wasn't feeling that great, and I wanted to lay down. Put on the TV, the door was closed, and I had her lay in bed with me. I've been a light sleeper my entire life because I'm used to someone opening the door while I'm asleep. I'm used to being on alert, especially with my child next to me. It's part of the reason she slept in bed with me so much. In my bed, with pillows stuffed against the wall, with the bed up against it so she couldn't fall, so the bed couldn't move.
Were the doors unlocked to your bedroom?
I thought that I had locked it, but maybe not. It's possible that the door was unlocked. I know my dad was at home. But I fell asleep and was asleep for a while. And I was awoken by him shaking me and asking me where Kaylee was, which didn't make sense because I looked next to me and that's where she was. TV was still on. She would never even leave my room without telling me, even if she had to go to the bathroom. She'd never just leave me there. She knew she wasn't allowed to just be in the house by herself. And I immediately start looking around the house. Her room, what used to be my brother's room, in the bathroom, the parents' room, the garage. I go outside and I'm looking to see where she could be. She's not in her playhouse. Where is she? Why is she not here? Didn't make sense. Still doesn't make sense. She'd never done that before. Why that day?
Did you look inside the pool?
Didn't have to. By the time I came back around from the left side of the house, I came back around towards the front porch. She's standing there with her. She's soaking wet. I can see him standing there with her in his arms and hand her to me and telling me that it's my fault, that I did that I caused that. And I just collapsed with her in my arms.
What did she feel like?
It's just heavy, it's just cold. As I'm sitting there with her on my lap, just hysterical. Just staring at her, not knowing what to do. He takes her from me and he immediately softens his tone and tells me it's going to be okay. That she was going to be okay. That's what he said to me. I wanted to believe him because I wanted her to be okay. And I don't know how long I sat outside. I don't know where he went. He took her from me and he walked away. I know he went back in through the screen doors and he went back into the house. But I don't know where she went. And I don't know what he did. I just want her back. It's all I wanted this entire time.
Okay, before I say anything else, let me say for what feels like the umpteenth time, I don't believe her. It's incredibly misleading to say that she is finally telling the truth when this story so closely resembles the story told years ago in 2011, except in that story, Kaylee's death was an accidental drowning, and in this story, we can already see that Casey is planting the seeds of an allegation that George Anthony took Kaylee's life on purpose, which I believe to be so ludicrous, it's offensive to me. And I don't even like George Anthony. I am not a George Anthony fan. I don't defend him in any way, shape, or form on any of his creepy, odd behavior. I think he's messed up, and I think he wasn't the best father or the best husband. But to say that he killed his 2-year-old granddaughter on purpose is just the most disgusting thing ever. Even Casey Anthony, who I 1,000,000% believe was responsible for Kaylee's death, even Casey Anthony, I can't say for sure that she did it on purpose. I would like to believe it was an accident, but she's out here legitimately saying like she thinks her father killed her daughter on purpose. And then you have idiots like Rosie O'Donnell taking to social media and being like, I believe Casey. I think George Anthony did it. Because if we go on the supposition that Kaylee died accidentally, we would have to look at Casey and say, why would you decide to lay down and take a nap early in the morning while your 2-year-old child was still awake? Okay, I have 3 kids, and believe it or not, all of them were 2 years old at one point. Kaylee was just 2, yes, going on 3, but that's not a huge difference. And we're supposed to believe that Kaylee, at 2.5, knew better than to get off the bed and wander through the house that she lived in without giving Casey the heads up. Like, what is Kaylee going to do? Excuse me, Mom. Excuse me. I'm going to get up and walk out of the room right now. No. 2-year-olds don't do that. Are we supposed to believe that Kaylee wouldn't even go to the bathroom without waking Casey up and letting her know? And I mean, let's be honest. Why is Kaylee going to the bathroom? She's still in a diaper. When her remains are found, she was wearing a diaper. And what if Kaylee couldn't wake Casey up? Apparently Casey is so exhausted that she slept all night, like normal people sleep at night, and then she has to lay down in the morning and take another nap. And on that note, why was Casey so tired right after breakfast? Did she not sleep the night before? Was she up all night on social media so she wasn't with it or alert enough to keep her eyes open during the daytime? The time when your child's awake and you're supposed to be providing supervision to your very young daughter? At this point, Casey doesn't even want anyone to look at her as a neglectful mother. She wants to come out of this as clean as a whistle. And I think she's living in some fantasy Narnia land if she thinks that there's any possibility of convincing anyone that she's 100% not at fault. I just took a nap and then I woke up and my daughter had drowned in the pool. What are you talking about? You shouldn't be taking naps during the day with your child next to you unless your child's in a crib where she cannot escape from. Oh, I put pillows up. Oh, pillows. Oh, no, pillows. Yes, Kaylee's just going to run into this wall of pillows and be like, what am I supposed to do? I can't get past all these soft, fluffy pillows. Now she's going to climb right over those bitches, man. Or she's going to push them out of the way. What are you talking about? And then Casey talks about holding Kaylee, feeling that she was still and cold, not moving, not breathing. Yet, when her father changed his voice to be more gentle and told her everything was going to be okay, she believed it. She wanted to believe that Kaylee was going to be okay, even though she was holding her cold, lifeless body. This is not a 12-year-old child we're talking about. I mean, my son's 11, and he would still have more sense in his head to know, Kaylee's not okay. Everything's not going to be okay. We're not talking about a child here. We're talking about a grown-ass woman. Casey was 22 years old in 2008, and I'm supposed to believe a 22-year-old grown-ass woman held the dead body of her child, but then when her father, who she clearly doesn't like or respect, who she clearly didn't respect even then, which you can hear in the way she speaks to him like she's his boss, because this dude that you don't trust who molested you and raped you and hurt you because this dude told you it was okay. You went along with your life for the next month thinking what? That Kaylee was out there somewhere? That everything was fine? Why? What are you talking about? She said she was confused but also hopeful because she believed that Kaylee was still okay. She said it was because she was brainwashed that she protected George Anthony, the person who hurt her and who she believes hurt her child. And it wasn't until later that she figured out why she was brainwashed and why she protected him. Now, let me tell you why I don't believe that. There are several instances where Casey gets into arguments, disagreements, and fights with her father during the 31 days she went MIA and withheld information from her parents about her daughter. June 16th, Casey drives away from the Anthony home with Kaylee in tow, according to George Anthony. June 18th, Casey borrows a shovel from her neighbor, Brian Berner, and she returned it an hour later. Like I said, she told him she needed to dig up a bamboo root in the yard. Do we believe that? No. So why did she need a shovel? She never said, but we know she borrowed it. The neighbor has no reason to lie. He doesn't have a horse in the game, and she's never denied asking him to borrow the shovel, although they don't talk about this during the docu-series, at least not in episode 1 and 2. You don't address the things that make you look guilty, Casey. And then on June 23rd, Casey went back to her parents' house and she broke into the shed on her parents' property and stole her father's gas cans so that she could put gas in her car because she was broke, because she wasn't working, because she didn't have a job, and she was stealing from her friends. And when she didn't have the opportunity to steal from her friends, she had to steal from her parents. And George Anthony realized someone had broken in and taken the gas cans. He thought it was a random burglar, so he called the police and reported that they'd been stolen. Now, would George Anthony, who had just murdered his granddaughter and hidden her body close to home, would he really have called the police and drawn attention to himself for a couple of gas cans? Nope. He would have been like, Casey stole my gas cans, but I'm just going to, let this go. Or even like, hey, some burglar came in and stole my gas cans, but I'm not trying to bring the police here right now. I don't want to see the police. I'm not trying to draw attention to myself. We're just going to let this ride. The next day after this, after the gas cans get stolen by Casey shows up at the Anthony home again because she would constantly show up there to take things like gas or money or get clothes for herself. Never clothes for Kaylee because Kaylee was no longer alive, and her father, George, confronted her about the missing gas cans, and she went to her trunk, and she took them out, and she threw them at him, and she was like, here's your fucking gas cans. She, threw them at his feet. So here's my question. Would someone who'd been brainwashed to protect their lifelong abuser have left the home and left their abuser and then continue to be brainwashed to the point where she would protect him over getting justice for the daughter she loved, and then proceed to act in a very non-brainwashed, aggressive, confrontational way where she's yelling and swearing at him and stealing from him and throwing gas cans at him? Which is it, Casey? Were you so brainwashed that you couldn't say a word to him or against him? Or were you so angry from what he had done to you and now to Kaylee that your true feelings were brimming over and you could no longer contain your distaste for him? You can't have it both ways, because if the latter is true, if you were so angry and you could no longer contain your distaste for him, then you would have wanted to see him pay, right? You would have gone to the police. From my experience of victims, of women especially who have lived in instances of domestic violence, they don't confront their attackers. They are afraid of their attackers. So they're not confronting their husbands. They're not throwing things at their husbands. They're not yelling. They're walking on eggshells around their abusers. They are not standing up for themselves. And when they leave, they don't come back to visit their abusers, not willingly, at least. And listen, we know that Casey was clearly angry at her father for something, right? Most likely just because her father wanted her to take accountability for something and was like, where's the gas cans? And she's like, I needed that gas, man. I don't have a job. I ain't got no money. And you stopped letting me steal from you. And I don't live here anymore, so I can't just take money out of mom's purse anymore. Because she was doing that. She was stealing from her grandmother, her grandfather who's in a nursing home, writing checks out of the bank account. She was stealing from everybody. Money. Okay? But most likely she was just angry because she had that lifeline kind of cut off. And she's like, how dare you begrudge me this gas? I am entitled to this. God forbid I should have to get a job. I'm helping my boyfriend train his shot girls. Well, you getting paid for that, bitch? Because no, you're not. Then you wouldn't have to steal from people. So is it a real job? No, she acts like it's a real job. She acts like in this docu-series that this is what she was doing. She'll talk about that later. This is what she was doing for her job. This was a real job. But you weren't getting paid for it, because if you were getting paid for it, you would have had money to put gas in your damn car. So Casey's angry at her father, and she's also angry at her mother, who she'd had a big fight with the night before Kaylee was last seen. Casey hated and resented her parents, both of them, for trying to control her, for trying to make her face uncomfortable questions like, where's the money you stole from us and from your grandmother? And while we're talking about missing stuff, where's your daughter? She didn't want to be asked those questions. She certainly didn't want to answer those questions. And it does, once again, not get talked about during this episode, at least these 2 episodes I've seen so far, that the real person Casey was having a constant power struggle with was her mother, Cindy, who had threatened to take her child. According to neighbors, according to Lee Anthony, the night before Casey took her daughter and left, Cindy was saying, you're a bad mother and I'm going to take your child from you because you're neglectful and you're not, doing what you need to be doing. And I don't feel like Kaylee's being taken care of well enough. I disagree with that. I do think that Casey was a young parent, and so sometimes she wanted to go out and blow off steam. But from what we can tell, Casey did care for Kaylee as much as a young mother who has no experience with that kind of thing can. Was she the best mother? Was she mother of the year? No, but I think she was doing her best. And I think that argument with Cindy pushed her over the edge. I think Casey was definitely harassed. I think Casey was definitely molested, but by both of her parents, in the fact that they are control freaks and hypocrites, and they wanted her to be something that they were not themselves. They wanted her to be this perfect mother when they themselves were not perfect parents. And that does put a lot of stress on somebody, and it does cause somebody to snap. But it doesn't mean she's not responsible for snapping. It doesn't mean she's not responsible for doing what she did, because we've all had shit in our lives. We've all gone through trauma. We've all had people who are toxic, who don't respect our boundaries, who hurt us, who make us feel like shit. We've all been there. It's what we choose to do with that, or what we choose to do because of that matters, Casey. The next portion of the episode, Casey brings us back to the jail, where she spent 3 years behind bars.
I was waiting in jail, being accused of a crime that I didn't commit. Remembering feeling alone and helpless and having literally no one in my corner.
She says she had no one in her corner, and once again, that is such bullshit. Her parents were always visiting her in jail, always talking to her, trying to get as much information as possible about what she remembered about Kaylee and the last time she'd seen Kaylee. And Casey, man, she's super upbeat and happy during these visits. But do you know who's not super upbeat and happy? Her parents, Cindy and George, who seem completely exhausted and overextended with worry. Their grandchild's missing and their daughter's in prison for her disappearance. Casey is completely upbeat and she seems over it. Like, she doesn't even want to talk about Kaylee because she's had a month to wrap her head around the reality of the situation. And Cindy and George seem shell-shocked because this is hitting them like a ton of bricks overnight.
I know. What do you want to say to us? That I love you. And that I miss you. And, you guys stay as strong as possible.
We are, Casey. Our whole life's turned upside down looking for this little girl.
I know. Trust me, if I could be out there with you, I would be in a heartbeat. Trying to help take the strain off of you, trying to find her. That's all I want to do.
We're going to see her little face again.
I pray to God every day that we do. Hello again.
We have 45 more minutes. They're been so gracious to give us the whole 45 minutes.
They're being generous today.
Well, I think everybody wants an end to all of this.
Oh, of course.
Okay? I have to ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did Kaylee ever stay at Tony's?
No.
Are you sure?
Positive. We hung out over there, but she'd never stayed, no.
Tony admitted to Lee that there's drugs in his home. Could this be related to something like that?
No, it's not.
Okay, just had to ask, sweetheart.
No, his roommates smoke weed, but no.
Oh, besides Lee and Dad and I, has anybody else visited you?
Yeah, Patrick Bourgeois. He was friends
Who's
with
that?
Mike Walker. Do you guys remember Mike Walker? Dad might.
Yeah.
From track.
Why? How did he get...
He came and saw me yesterday about 9:10 in the morning. He was the first person that had actually come up to see me as far as a phone call is concerned. He just wanted to basically tell me that I have friends on the outside. Mike passed on a message telling me that he hopes that I'm okay, to keep my head up. I don't know who a lot of the people are that live in our neighborhood outside of...
Well, I forget who she told, but she told someone that I was hospitalized recently with a mental condition.
Wow. I'm glad I'm not on the outside. I'm really glad I'm not out there.
You'd be surprised the crap that's coming, that
Mom,
people
but see,
think
that's
that
just
they...
it. I'm not surprised at the crap that's coming. That's another reason I don't want to hear any of this media bullshit. People want to have their face on the news, want to have their 2 seconds of fame. I never once wanted to be on TV or to have anything, period, let alone it be the worst catastrophic thing that could happen not only to myself but to our family. I mean, it doesn't surprise me what people are going to do or say to try to get attention.
Well, there's only a few people, Casey, because everybody that knows you, the thing that they're saying most is that you're the mom of the group. You're the one that always takes care of everybody else.
That's how it's always been.
And in this clip that I'm showing you, which isn't in the docu-series, Casey's just talking about who's visited her. She's got friends, people are on her side, people on the outside talking to her, telling her, like, we've got your back. Even though she hid from them for over a month that her daughter was gone, her family is still on her side, still hoping for the best because once again, they don't want to admit that Casey may have been responsible in any way. That's why Casey always got away with lying, because her family cared very much about appearances, and it was easier to believe her than to start a big thing about her being dishonest. So if anyone was brainwashed, if anyone was suffering from PTSD, it was George and Cindy Anthony from having to be gaslit by Casey for over 20 years. You can see that they're handling her with kid gloves. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to say the wrong thing and have her shut down. They want information from her about Kaylee. So they're dealing with her like she's a little child where if you rub her the wrong way, she's just going to shut down, throw a fit, and not give you what you want. Casey has the answer. She's the key to finding out where Kaylee is. And so they're treating her like a bomb that could go off at any moment, and that would destroy that valuable information. Now, could this have something to do with Tony and drugs? Cindy asks her. No, definitely not. Okay, just had to ask, sweetheart. What about this interaction tells you that A, Casey is all alone with no one on her side, and B, Casey knows that her daughter is dead, and the only other person in the world who knows that and who knows what actually happened is sitting across from her. The truth is, Casey was the one who knew what happened. The whole pool thing with George holding Kaylee's body in his arms and promising he would take care of it, that never happened. It was all made up because Casey is a born fabulist with an imagination unfettered by the laws of logic and probability, and the fact that no one believes her drives her insane, and it drives her to come up with more stories, more flourishes, more dramatic facial expressions, and more forced tears. So then we hear from a woman named Robin Adams, who was in jail with Casey back in 2008, and she showed us letters that Casey wrote to her behind bars talking about the alleged sexual abuse at the hands of her father and brother, which apparently Casey had suppressed these memories until she was away from her family and in jail. That's what she says. Remember, the memories come flooding back to her. Just at these random moments, but it's a different story about when the memories come flooding back every time we hear from Casey. And how convenient, right, that they come flooding back to you when you were in jail. It's not like you were away from your family for an entire whole 31 days while you were pretending that your daughter was alive and well. You had to go to jail before you could really feel like you were away from them and allow these memories to come flooding back. Memories which you previously had no inclination of, according to you. It's just very lucky for Casey that these memories did come back when she was locked in a cell, accused with the murder of her daughter, and she needed a handy fall guy to blame. Not to blame for the murder, to blame for the reason that Casey was so fucked up, the reason she partied and danced and got tattoos and acted like she was having the time of her life. Now, initially, she didn't blame her past trauma or George Anthony for Kaylee's death. Remember, in 2011, during the trial, she said it was an accident. It was an accident, and George helped her cover it up. George hid Kaylee's body. But this new accusation that's going to happen in this series, which hasn't even happened yet after 2 episodes, she hasn't come right out and say it. This new accusation where Casey is basically saying, that her father killed her daughter on purpose. That's going to come out in this new Peacock series so many years later. I mean, the trial happened in 2011. She didn't say that then. It's 2022, 11 years later. All of a sudden, that's what you think happened. But either way, whether it's her lying or the death of her daughter, she needs someone to blame for it other than herself. It can't be her own fault that she's a liar. It can't be her own fault that lying and manipulating and stealing has gotten her what she wanted her whole life, so that's why she continued to do it. It's somebody else's fault that she's a fucked up person. Now, in this episode, Casey goes into very specific detail about the abuse. They even have a corresponding animation. It's absolutely disgusting. It's such a, shameless display of sensationalism, but she's got all of these very vivid and specific memories, from the eyelet white cover on her bed to the smell of her father's Halston cologne. And I'm impressed because I happen to be very familiar with childhood trauma. I've been researching it and reading about it for the past year and a half, very dedicated to learning as much as I can about it. And the way these memories come back, which usually doesn't happen without the help of a trained professional and a lot of time, and they never really come back in this much detail. But this is a Casey Anthony special after all, and this is her specialty, to be dramatic and to make these statements that nobody can disprove because it's her truth. But here is the bombshell.
And talking to you so gently and starting off being so kind and so nice. God forbid I fought back. A few times I do remember trying to fight back. I was never able to push him off of me. Pillow goes over my face.
What do you mean by pillow goes over my face?
He smothered me several times.
Smothered you so you would pass out?
Several times. If I asked for it not to happen. Not tonight, please, not tonight. I just want to go to sleep. Wake up the next morning or even hours later, knowing that it had happened again.
Did Casey really just say that her father would smother her until she passed out while he was molesting her? What? That's a new one. She never said that in 2011. She never even said that to her psychiatrists. And as we know, what the prosecution believed to Caylee Anthony is that she was smothered. So are you putting the pieces together yet? Casey Anthony and the producers of this docu-series, they hope you are. And this is so gross, and I'm so disgusted by it. We are at a place and a time in history where women finally have this semblance of legitimacy, where we have heard people say that we should believe all women when they speak up about their physical, mental, or sexual abuse, and that's amazing. And it really should be that way, because for decades, so many women were not believed and they were silenced. Unfortunately, you have people like Amber Heard and Casey Anthony, women who don't deserve that title of woman, who will lie and use the believe all women momentum of the moment to their advantage. Because you're a bad person if you tell a woman in 2022 that you don't believe her when she speaks out about her abuse. You're a bad person. I mean, there's literally people that I saw in my comment section from the first video being like, don't compare Amber Heard, a victim of abuse, to Casey Anthony, a murderer. Like, what? What? Amber Heard has been proven to not be a victim of abuse. Casey Anthony has not been proven to be a murderer. Like, I definitely think she is, allegedly, don't come for me. But Amber Heard's already been proven to be a liar. So you're twisted up in your head if you think that there's anything about that woman that's truthful. Amber Heard is a liar. She lied. Abuse victims, real abuse victims, don't need to make up stories about abuse. They don't need to paint on bruises. They don't need to do that stuff because they're actually abused. It's insulting to women if you believe somebody like Amber Heard when there's real women out there who do go through this stuff. Because just because a person has a vagina between their legs, it doesn't make them a saint. It doesn't make them above lying to save their own ass or to get what they want. And without a shred of proof, making allegations like this is, in my opinion, a very obvious attempt to pass the buck, and Casey doesn't care who she hurts or whose life she ruins in the process. She never has. Let's talk about childhood abuse and repressed memories, because the way Casey Anthony makes it seem is that this happened to her, first at the hands of her father, and then at the hands of her brother, and she blocked it out completely. She had no memory of it until she was behind bars and everything came flooding back, or until she was at her trial and the trauma expert was speaking and everything came flooding back, or, until any of the other moments that she says everything came flooding back. According to the APA, or the American Psychological Association, the question of whether a memory can be forgotten and then remembered lies at the heart of childhood abuse issues. Quote, experts in the field of memory and trauma can provide some answers, but clearly more study and research are needed. What we do know is that both memory researchers and clinicians who work with trauma victims agree that both phenomena occur. However, experienced clinical psychologists state that the phenomenon of recovered memory is rare. For example, one experienced practitioner reported having a recovered memory arise only once in 20 years of practice. Some clinicians believe that severe forms of child sexual abuse are especially conducive to negative disturbances of memory, such as dissociation or delayed memory. Many clinicians who work with trauma victims believe that this dissociation is a person's way of sheltering himself or herself from the pain of the memory. Many researchers argue, however, that there is little or no empirical support for such a theory. End quote. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that there is a consensus among memory researchers and clinicians that most people who were sexually abused as children remember all or part of what happened to them, although they may not fully understand or disclose it. The APA goes on to state, quote, concerning the issue of a recovered versus a pseudo-memory, like many questions in science, the answer is yet to be known. But most leaders in the field agree that although it is a rare occurrence, a memory of early childhood abuse that has been forgotten can be remembered later. However, these leaders also agree that it is possible to construct convincing pseudo-memories for events that never occurred, end quote. So, in case you didn't know, a pseudo-memory is a false memory. So we could just as easily say that since it's more common to create false memories, that's what Casey's doing. It's the exception, not the norm, to recover this memory that you've completely lost and to remember it all of a sudden years later. It's not very common. It's far more common to create false memories. So if you want to go by the science, we could definitely say that maybe Casey Anthony was molested, maybe she went through trauma, and maybe because of that, she's creating all of these false memories about seeing her father murder her child or holding her child's dead body. Maybe she's truly convinced herself that that's what happened. It's possible. That's more possible than her just completely burying these memories until years later and then them like come flooding back at random times. Because although that is how we kind of see these things portrayed in media, but technically, according to the medical professionals, that's really not how it happens. I would believe that Casey remembered her abuse and just felt too much shame to talk about it. I would believe that when she was young, she was afraid to talk about it. But to believe that she completely forgot about it and then it all came rushing back, that's the rare exception, not the norm, and I don't believe her. But of course she wants to believe that because in her book, she's the main character, She is the exception and not the norm. I believe it's convenient for Casey to have remembered this right when she was being forced to answer for herself and her bad behavior for the first time in her life. See, any other time in Casey's life that she was asked to explain herself, she would run away, ignore, avoid, detach. No one could ever pin her down long enough to force her to face the damage she had caused to a person or to a relationship. Her family enabled this. I remember one of her friends from high school told a story about how Casey would do fucked up things to her friends. And if they confronted her about it, Casey's brother Lee would come in and get angry and get between Casey and her friends and be like, you need to leave her alone. You know this is just how she is. As if that's an excuse. This is just how Casey is. She's an asshole. She treats people like shit. She uses people, and when she's done with you, she throws you away like a Kleenex she just blew her nose into. That's how she is. You better love and accept her for who she is. Leave her alone. Don't ask her to be responsible for the negative emotions she's caused in you. That's not her problem. This is what her family did. Lee, Cindy, George Anthony, they all enabled Casey to be an absolute compulsive liar who never had to be held accountable for the hurt that she caused others. But now, after what happened to Kaylee, Casey was literally behind bars. There's no place to go. You can't run anywhere. And Casey can't take accountability. She doesn't know what that looks like. She doesn't know what that feels like. She doesn't know how to do that. So she looks for somewhere else to shift the blame and the weight of the responsibility. That's what she's always done, and that's what she was doing now. And let's look at what Judge Belvin Perry had to say after hearing this new allegation, or at least this new spin on an old allegation, that George Anthony killed Kaylee on purpose. So Judge Perry said that Casey's always been one for dramatic flair and that her claims are just not believable at all. He said there were two sides of Casey Anthony that he saw during the trial. Quote, on the one side, she was quiet and shy in the presence of the jury, very calm, very collected. I don't want to say the word mousy, but she had this low-key demeanor. But when the jury was not there, she was very much in charge. Her personality became a lot more outgoing. She was not a shrinking violet anymore, and she was engaging with her attorneys. They were two clear contrasts. I call them the two faces of Casey. It was quite evident she knew how to play, work, and take advantage of the audience that she was put before. When she needed to be, she would be timid and not intimidating, as opposed to being outgoing and louder, or what some people would consider the real Casey, end quote. And that's exactly what Casey's doing now with this Peacock series. Who watches true crime? According to the research, true crime audiences are made up of 73% women, and Casey Anthony is playing to her audience. She's trying to appeal to women who have been victimized, who have been hurt, who have experienced abuse and trauma. That's a good percentage of us. And I think it's disgusting. And she should be ashamed of herself, which is, once again, a funny sentence to string together, because I don't think that this woman has ever felt a shred of shame in her life. And I'm almost a little envious of that, because I would like to feel less shame. I would like to be able to go through life not giving a shit about anything or anyone. Not always, right? But sometimes you feel like it would be easier. I don't think Kaylee has ever felt a shred of shame. And also, I think the people who created this series should be ashamed of themselves. And if I was George Anthony, I would sue. I would sue so hard that Kaylee never pops her head out again. And listen, at this point, in this series, I was only 20 minutes into this episode, this second episode, and I feel that I've already torn argument after argument apart, because Kaylee doesn't have an argument. She doesn't have anything besides her feelings and her emotions to present us with. And I want to apologize to all of the women out there who have experienced harm at the hands of a parent, who have experienced sexual abuse, who have experienced any kind of abuse. To know that this woman is basically co-opting your pain and your trauma for her own advantage, so that, it's crazy. She's already gotten away with killing her daughter, allegedly, in my opinion. Don't come for me. She's already gotten away with that. So what does she want from us? It's not enough for her to get away with it legally. She has to convince everybody that she's a good person. Why is it so important to her to do that? Why does she care what we think? So I apologize that she's using your very real trauma, your very real pain, to basically convince the world that she's a good person. And this woman, Janine, who worked on Casey's defense team, she actually addresses this lack of evidence issue.
When you've been a victim of sexual abuse, you pretend that nothing is wrong. It's the separation of the mind from the actions, right? That's how Kaylee can show up as if she had no troubles in the world during the 31 days where she's lost her baby, Kaylee. Finding evidence, which is part of my job as mitigation specialist, any evidence of abuse is very difficult, especially with the passing of time.
So we can't look at Casey's actions during that 31 days to determine her level of guilt because she's damaged and she doesn't act like an average person. And we can't look at actual evidence because finding evidence of such a thing, her abuse, is difficult, especially as time passes. How convenient. But wait, Kaylee did tell other people that she was being abused, but not about the abuse from her father, the abuse from her brother Lee, which there's also no evidence of. I don't believe her about that. But then she goes on to say that years later, she told her mother, Cindy, about Lee abusing her. Kaylee was just an infant at this point. They were sitting on the floor of Kaylee's room, and Kaylee finally found the courage to say something. But Cindy called her a whore. She said, "That's why you're a whore." But wait, earlier in this episode, Kaylee said she didn't even start to remember this stuff until she was in jail, and it all came flooding back. Kaylee said if her mom didn't believe her or didn't care about Lee abusing her, then why would she believe her about George Anthony? Why wouldn't that be the first thing you told Cindy? That's the worst of the abuse, right? Why wouldn't you tell your mother about that? Or why would you choose to tell her anything? Was the Lee Anthony thing like a test to see how she would react? And are we really supposed to believe that Cindy Anthony looked at Kaylee and said, "Oh, your brother abused you, so that's why you're a whore"? I don't believe it. Listen, once again, not a fan of Cindy Anthony. I don't even like Cindy Anthony. But I do know that she kisses Kaylee's ass. Every single conversation we've heard between them, every single thing that we've saw as far as their dynamic, Cindy Anthony kisses Kaylee's ass. She always has. She protects her. She enables her. She defends her. I mean, we literally have Cindy Anthony defending Kaylee in court when they found out about those chloroform searches, that Kaylee had made on the computer. And Cindy Anthony was like, no, that was me. I was searching chlorophyll and it just typed in chloroform over 80 times, Cindy. And then it comes out, well, Cindy wasn't even at home when those searches were made. Cindy was at work. We're going to talk about that more in depth later. I don't know. I think it's next episode, but we're going to talk more about that in depth. Cindy Anthony was not at home when those chloroform searches were made, but she lied and said she was searching chlorophyll. She lies for her daughter. She kisses her daughter's ass. So why would she say that to Kaylee? It doesn't make sense. The dynamic that they have doesn't support that. I can see Cindy saying like, hey, I'm worried about Kaylee with you as a mother because you haven't been very responsible and you've been like leaving her and abandoning her. And I don't know where you're bringing her. And I don't like that you bring her around your friends. So I'm going to, think about taking custody from you. I can see her saying that. But to just look at her daughter who's confessing to being sexually molested by her brother, your son, and to say that's why you're a whore just doesn't add up. But then in the last episode, remember in episode 1, Kaylee said she thought that her mom always knew because she tried to dress Kaylee to look younger so that she wouldn't be sexualized by her own father. And then in this same episode that we're talking about, now they play a news clip where they're talking about the prison letters that Kaylee was exchanging with Robin Adams. And she says she thought she may have also been abused by her father. So listen, I know I just said a lot of stuff. It's confusing. Back then, around the time that Kaylee went missing, around the time of the trial, Kaylee Anthony allegedly told her ex-boyfriend, Jesse Grund, that Lee Anthony abused her. And allegedly, she also told her mother, Cindy, that Lee Anthony abused her. And Cindy said, that's why you're a whore. And then in these prison letters from 2011, when Kaylee was in prison, she wrote to her jail friend and said, I'm having these memories rushing back. Like my brother Lee abused me. And I also think that I may have been abused by my father. So she goes from thinking she may have been abused by her father in these jailhouse letters, may have been abused, to, a few months later in court, she absolutely was abused. That's what her defense tried to put into the trial, but the judge wouldn't let them because there was no evidence of it. In my opinion, Kaylee trotted out the Lee Anthony abuse story to test it on her audience, which was Robin, for instance, her jail friend, a woman who had been through her own share of shit and pain in her life, because Kaylee wanted to see how readily she would be believed. She tested out the potential George Anthony abuse story as well to see if Robin would encourage her to dig deeper and share more. That was her test. When they are putting together a trial and they get a test jury and they run the defense argument by the test jury to see how readily the jury believes it, this is what Kaylee was doing with Robin and with Jesse Grund as well. And I don't believe she ever said that to Cindy Anthony. And while we're hearing about all of this, right, all of this horrible stuff that happened to Kaylee when she was just a kid, an innocent little kid, we see pictures of young Kaylee flashing across the screen and the sad piano music in the background. Very much purposely done to elicit an emotion from us. And because, most of us watching this are women who are just maternal and nurturing and also have been through our share of shit and been hurt by people that we loved, been hurt by people we thought we could trust. Because of that, there's going to be an innate quality in a lot of us to feel empathy for her, especially if you don't know the whole story, which I am starting to think that very few people do. And that's why I'm here.
At that point, Kaylee had not told anyone working on the team about the abuse except for me.
Even here.
She had not told.
She's
Jose.
on. She knows the camera's watching.
I said to Kaylee, be open and transparent, Kaylee. Right? I hope the team...
Be open and transparent, Kaylee. You might as well ask for a magical unicorn named Bob, made out of Skittles, to gallop down from the clouds and transform snowflakes into gumdrops. You're asking a lot out here, Janine. Then we are introduced to Dr. Harry Kropp and Dr. Stephen Gold, two clinical psychologists who examined Kaylee, and apparently they found her to have no mental illness and no sign of psychopathy. And they made a big deal out of this as if it's some revelation. And they play all these clips of news anchors and media personalities calling Kaylee a psychopath. And then the doctors are like, no, she's not actually. The media was wrong. And so what? Does Kaylee Anthony need to be a psychopath to be guilty? No. A lot of people felt that her behavior in the aftermath of Kaylee's disappearance and death was off, and that it was bizarre the way that she went on with her life as if nothing happened. But you don't need to be a psychopath to do something bad or illegal, and you don't need to be a psychopath to act strangely in the wake of what is generally considered to be a tragedy by most normal people. If Casey was responsible for taking the life of her child, would we expect her to be walking around crying all the time, or would we expect her to be acting as if nothing was wrong because she didn't want to get caught and go to prison? What would we be expecting a guilty person who wants to get away with murder to be doing in the aftermath of their crime? Would they be crying all day and night? Would they be like walking around like a zombie in a haze? Would they be over here like making spontaneous confessions about how bad of a person they are? No, probably not. If somebody doesn't want to be caught, they're probably gonna, be acting like everything's fine and like there's nothing wrong. It's not like you need to be a psychopath to do that. You just have to be a person who doesn't want to get their ass thrown in prison or get the death penalty. And honestly, I hate to do this, but I'm not above wondering if a female psychologist or a female mental health professional had examined Casey, would she have gotten a different result? Would this female psychologist have come to a different conclusion? Because let's be honest, Casey Anthony is very manipulative and charming when it comes to the opposite sex. And although Dr. Krupp is a professional, he's also a man, and he's not immune to the charms of the fairer sex. Dr. Drew Pinsky had the same question when he interviewed Dr. Krupp back in 2011, and this was actually the second time that Dr. Drew and Dr. Krupp had spoken. And Dr. Drew, the first time he talked to Dr. Krupp, he was shocked when Dr. Krupp had said Casey had no signs of any personality disorder. And here's a clip from their first interaction.
I'm gonna interrupt you. Do you mean, now this is you, two clinicians talking here, I'll explain what I mean in a second. Do you mean Axis 1 diagnoses, or are you including Axis 2 in that?
For Casey, I'm including both Axis 1 and Axis 2.
Okay.
And one of the reasons
I'm going to say for the public, what he and I are talking about, Axis 1 are diagnoses like depression and anxiety disorders and psychotic illnesses. People have thought disorders. They believe they're Napoleon, that kind of thing. Axis 2 is really what we've been talking about with Casey, which is chronic behavioral disturbances, lying, interpersonal chaos. It's hard for me, Dr. Krupp, to understand how she could not have an Axis 2 diagnosis.
I understand how that's difficult, both for you as well as the public, to believe that she doesn't have an Axis 2 disorder. I've seen on your show, as well as some of the other shows on your network, individuals coming on and making references to her as either a psychopath or a sociopath. One of the reasons that Casey actually authorized me to go public with the results of my evaluation was because she wanted it known to the public, both the good and the bad of Casey. But I think Casey feels that, and for obvious reasons, that the public has really only seen part of who Casey Anthony really is.
All right, so let me ask another question. So she may not have a diagnosable disorder with Axis 2. Does she have what we call borderline traits or sociopathic traits?
No, she doesn't have those traits either.
That's impossible. I can't believe that. Wait a minute, doctor, I can't believe that. She's created a vortex. She's a chronic liar. She's engaging in criminal behavior. How is that possible?
She's an intelligent woman, but basically an extremely immature woman. You have to understand that the Casey that I have been involved with, and I didn't get involved in the case until November of 2010, when I was requested to evaluate her for specifically for the purpose of possibly testifying at her sentencing phase if she were convicted. So I did not see the Casey that is shown on the TV and is shown on some of the videos and the recordings when she talked to her mother. When I spoke to Casey about those conversations and some of the things that have been shown on TV, she herself, and I'm not suggesting that she is denying that, but she herself has a difficult time truly understanding how she could have been so immature and how she could have engaged in the kind of behavior that the public has seen so much of her.
Again, I'm left with a big question mark over my head, because that's sort of our job, to try to understand those things and understand how she could have been. Was she involved in any negligence towards her child? I have 30 seconds for that answer.
No, not that I'm aware of.
According to Dr. Kropp, Kaylee is extremely smart, but also extremely immature. That's a recipe for disaster, by the way, but let's ignore that. And Dr. Kropp says, I didn't see the Kaylee that everyone else saw. I saw a different Kaylee. Is it possible, Dr. Kropp, that you saw the Kaylee that Kaylee wanted you to see, right? Like, is that possible? Because she's very manipulative. We know that Kaylee was friends with more men than women. She felt more comfortable with men than women. Even in her psychological analysis, they said that she displayed more like masculine traits. She preferred the company of men to women because she knew that she could manipulate men. And she knew that women really, didn't like her because they saw right through her. And that is still the case. We still don't like you, and we still see right through you. So the second time Dr. Drew had Dr. Kropp on his show, Dr. Drew was like, listen, I've been doing my research, and I'm still having a hard time with you saying that Kaylee Anthony is completely mentally healthy. And Dr. Kropp responded, quote, well, let me go back to the first issue, the one where, when we talked the other day, I talked about no personality disorder, which I still stick to as far as all the data. But you asked me about personality traits, and one of the qualities of a forensic psychologist, hopefully, is a willingness to revisit certain issues if there is a question. After you and I spoke, I did research. I went back to the data. I went back to all the interviews. I looked at the tapes, the depositions, and I would say that again, not diagnosing her as a personality disorder, but certainly I would agree that Kaylee does have narcissistic traits, end quote. So Dr. Kropp says, okay, Kaylee has narcissistic traits. Dr. Drew, for the sake of the audience watching, to clarify what narcissistic traits are, he says, hey, what does this mean? Let me put up a list of narcissistic traits from the DSM-5. And Dr. Drew goes on to read off this list, and he says, quote, has a grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupied with fantasies about power, arrogant, haughty behavior towards others, lacks empathy, and is unwilling to identify with the needs of others, particularly in certain situations. And that kind of fits, right? End quote. Dr. Kropp responded, quote, I would agree with that, especially 3 years ago when all of this was going on. I would certainly agree that those traits existed in Kaylee, end quote. Dr. Drew goes on to say, quote, and the other thing is the lying, and this is the only thing that we all know really for sure was happening. There was horrible, wild lying going on. Lying doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's no such thing. There's no diagnosis of pathological lying. It goes with other disorders. Is this part of her narcissistic disorder, or are there something called borderline traits here too? End quote. So Dr. Kropp says, I don't think there are borderline traits. Let me go back to the lying issue because you and I also discussed that the other day. I went ahead and did extensive research on different types of lying, and I'm going to be a little hesitant here to be specific with regard to Kaylee because I learned actually from listening to your show before I came on air about the lawsuits, and they have to do rather the appellate issues having to do with her lying. So I'm not going to be specific to Kaylee about lying, but the research I did shows there's 3 kinds of lying. One is pathological lying, and that's not a diagnosis. It's not in the DSM. The second type of lying is, I guess, what we call ordinary lying, and then the third type of lying is what we would call chronic or rather obsessive type of lying or habitual lying. I'll let you or your panel or the viewers determine as far as it applies to Kaylee, but pathological lying is just as the word sounds. It's very pathological. It's an individual who is pretty much a lifelong, very frequent and repeated lies, often and usually without any particular motive, without any either psychological motive or external motive, and then the person doesn't even admit or recognize him or herself that they're lying. And Dr. Drew says, right. Okay, so then Dr. Drew says, let me do one little piece of cross-examination myself before I let you go here. And that is, your job's to go in there and kind of empathize with these people who are facing death penalties. I mean, that's your job. Get in their head and sort of understand it and empathize with it. Do you think it's possible that you've gone too far with Kaylee to see her point of view, that she's manipulated you and you've identified so strongly with her perhaps that it's colored some of what you're saying to us today? And Dr. Kropp responds, Dr. Drew, with all due respect, I don't agree with you at all in regard to the empathy. I've listened to people like Eileen Warnos and Danny Rolling in Florida, and I have listened and tried to be as unemotional as I can listening to their stories. I don't think, could somebody like Casey pull the wool over my eyes? Sure, but I really don't think that happened. I'm looking at the data. I came in pretty late in the case. Casey has been nothing but professional in her actions with me. Somebody, one of the blogs, talked about her being flirtatious, and probably flirtatious with all the men, Jose and Cheney and myself. I never had any of that. Do I empathize with her in her situation? We're talking about the life here and the death of a 2-year-old girl. That's who I empathize with. I feel that, although I certainly admit that I can be fooled, I'm sure. I've been fooled several times, but I don't believe that Casey has fooled me. Okay, so that's the person who's in this docu-series who's talking about how, Casey's not a psychopath. She has no clinical mental disorders. Once again, she doesn't need to have any mental disorder. She doesn't need to be a psychopath. She's incredibly narcissistic, which Dr. Kropp, agreed to himself here. Dr. Kropp was saying, on second thought, at this time that this was going on, 2008, Casey Anthony certainly exhibited traits of narcissism. He also agreed that those traits include being obsessed with fantasies, lacking empathy for others, and unwillingness to identify with the needs of others. So Casey was very intelligent, very immature, and also had these traits of narcissism, lack of empathy, and an unwillingness to identify with the needs of others. At the time that her 2-year-old daughter went missing and then turned up dead. But we're not supposed to talk about that or look at that. We're supposed to pay attention to Casey's newly unburied memories and the allegations that she's not a psychopath, as if she needs to be a psychopath to do what she did. Is every person who's committed murder a psychopath now? Why does it even matter? Because they want to show that the news people were saying that, but it's not true. But it doesn't matter that the news people were saying it. News people say a lot of things. People in the media don't necessarily understand what the term psychopath means clinically. So they use it in a way of like, oh, somebody who does something shitty is a psychopath. They use it in a very sensationalized, clickbaity way. They don't mean it clinically. So they're kind of like distracting us. Like, over here, look over here. The media said she was a psychopath, but here's a clinical psychologist who sat with her and he says she's not. And who cares? What does it have to do with anything? Are you just trying to show us that the media said something that wasn't true? Whoa, like knock me over with a feather. That happens every day, dude. We are not supposed to pay attention to the fact that Casey was intelligent and immature and narcissistic at the time her daughter was killed. We're supposed to pay attention to Casey's newly unburied memories and believe that her father, George Anthony, is somehow responsible. And even though Casey always acts in her own best interests, for years she sat behind bars knowing she wasn't responsible and knowing who was. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. I don't believe that Casey, who always looks out for number one, allowed herself to sit behind bars for 3 years knowing who actually committed the crime and didn't say anything to anyone. But again, Casey doesn't want us to pay attention to the evidence. She doesn't want us to look at the way she was acting or how she behaved, all the lies. She just wants us to listen to how she feels and forget everything else. Everything we know, everything that every cell in our bodies is screaming at us, telling us that what she did is only explainable by one obvious answer, and that is that Casey Anthony is responsible for what happened to Kaylee in some way, and she knows exactly the truth about what happened to Kaylee.
Tell me about your behavior leaving the house and then 31 days.
The media?
And the public have used this again and again as a hammer to hammer you with.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Ugh, we used her behavior, the things that we can see with our own eyes to hammer her, but we shouldn't do that. We should listen with our hearts to her feelings and use that to make our decision, even when she's clearly still lying, has always lied, and the grief and the pain that she's exhibiting are as shallow and empty as the gaping black hole where her soul used to be. Probably never was, actually. I don't think she had one, ever. So Casey claims that after she held her daughter's cold, lifeless body in her arms, and her father was like, "Don't worry, Casey, I'll take care of this." Casey then drove over to her boyfriend Tony Lazzaro's apartment, and she tells us that this is where she stayed for about 3 weeks of the 31 days that she was gone. And she said, "Yes, I acted completely normal, and I acted like nothing was wrong. But that was what my father told me to do, after all." And then we, see her in pictures partying, having a great time. She says she wasn't having a great time. She was working. That was her job, helping her boyfriend Tony promote his club and the shot girls and stuff. Like, but were you getting paid, bitch? No, you weren't. You weren't getting paid. You can't tell me that this was a job. This was something you were doing to impress Tony. This was something you were doing to like worm your way into his life. This is something you were doing to fulfill your desire to remain forever young and act like you had no responsibilities. You weren't getting paid, because if you were getting paid, which is, a prerequisite of a job, if you were getting paid, then you would have had money to put gas in your car and you wouldn't have had to steal your dad's gas cans. If you were getting paid, you would have had money to, get an apartment and get your daughter out of the house of a pedophile.
But you weren't going through the cycles of grief.
No. During the 31 days, I genuinely believed that Kaylee was still alive. My father kept telling me she was okay. I just had to keep following his instructions.
This doesn't make any sense.
There were no threats. I just knew that I had to do what he wanted me to do, and the same reason that I knew that since the time I was 8 years old. Just do what he wants. It worked before, do it now.
So you shut down and you became robotic.
Did what I needed to do to survive.
I am so pissed. I keep getting more and more angry every minute I watch this ridiculous series and this ridiculous person. First of all, everything hinges on us believing in this childhood abuse. Everything. Casey said she held her daughter's cold, wet, limp, lifeless body in her arms. Her father screamed at her, "This is your fault. You did this. Look what happened." And then he said, "Oh, Kaylee's fine." And then Casey believed that for the next 31 days. What? She didn't ask where Kaylee was. She didn't ask who was taking care of Kaylee. Doesn't that also make you a shitty parent? Yes. And a shitty person? Yes. If the man who abused you for several years of your young life hides your daughter away from you and everyone else for over a month, are you not going to demand to see her, at least see like proof of life, a picture, talk to her on the phone? The fact that you thought your 2-year-old daughter was with who you claimed to be a pedophile and you didn't try to find her or call the police to find her, that makes you a shitty mother, even if this story is true, which it's not, in my opinion, because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And Casey thinks she can just say the most off-the-wall, nonsensical, illogical bullshit and then just cry and say, like, this is my truth and this is my story and believe all women. So you can't question me about this. We're in 2022. You don't question women about, what they claim happened in the past. Nobody can question me. Nobody can say I'm lying. Well, I'm saying it, bitch. I'm saying you're lying. You're lying. She expects us to just lap all of this nonsensical, illogical bullshit up. And then when a hard question is asked, like, well, why didn't you call the police and tell them that your pedophile father who abused you for years is now in possession of your daughter and no one's seen her in a month? When that question is asked, when the hard questions are asked, Casey just scrunches up her face and talks about her childhood trauma. She did what she needed to do to survive. Fuck whatever her daughter was going through at the hands of this horrible man. Casey had to survive. If Casey believed that Kaylee was still alive with George Anthony, why would she have continued on, going out, partying with friends and acting like nothing was happening? It doesn't matter which way you slice this pie. You come out looking horrible, Casey. No matter what lie you come up with, it's never a good enough one to explain away your shitty behavior and the fact that you were a shitty mother, a negligent mother, and a bad person, and you still are a bad person. If you had any scrap of humanity left in you, you would not be dishonoring your daughter's memory in this way. You would have let her rest in peace, and you would stop trying to manipulate and brainwash people into believing a false version of events about how Kaylee died. The least that Kaylee deserves is the truth of her end. Be what people know, so that she can properly be mourned by these people, the public, us, who care more about your daughter than you ever did, so that we can understand finally that Kaylee's life was over the second she became an imposition to you. And I don't even feel bad saying that, because although Casey was found not guilty of murder, a month after a jury made that stupid decision, the Department of Children and Families found that Casey, quote, is the caregiver responsible for the verified maltreatments of death, threatening harm, and failure to protect. The Department of Children and Families concludes that the actions or lack of actions by the alleged perpetrator ultimately resulted or contributed in the death of the child. End quote. But like I said, you won't hear about that in this docu-series. There's not enough time to talk about that stuff. Not enough time to talk about the facts when Casey Anthony needs to talk about her feelings. And we need to hear sad piano music playing and Casey wandering the swamps taking pictures while wearing yoga pants. That's more important than the facts that DCF found you to be a negligent mother, found you to be responsible, directly or indirectly, for the death of your child. Casey claims that she was in contact with her father daily, whether she was seeing him at the house or talking to him on her phone, and it was then that she was demanding answers from him, and he told her, don't worry, she's fine. You and Kaylee will be reunited soon. She keeps talking about how she was physically afraid of George, but she also wanted to believe him so badly that Kaylee was alive. But then, in December of 2008, when Kaylee's remains were found, that hope was crushed. But she still didn't come forward and tell the police about this George Anthony in the swimming pool event. She still protected him. Make it make sense. At this point, I'm about halfway through this episode, and I can tell you I really wanted to turn it off. I was like, I think 38 minutes in, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. Because I knew that what Casey was going to do was keep bringing up each point, each time she looked suspicious. And then she was going to say, well, keep in mind now, look through this new lens. Remember what I was going through, what I had gone through. And abuse and trauma, those things aren't straightforward. It doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me. But you have to understand, I was a victim. Look at me through the victim lens so that you don't judge me too harshly.
Yes, I was naive. Yes, I was dumb. Clearly, no matter how smart I was dumb. This whole time leading up to that, I thought that there was a chance she could still be alive. I was telling the truth about... I thought there was still a chance.
Can't get those tears out, huh? You want to.
It's an instinct you're supposed to have as a parent to know something is wrong with your child.
Where's the tears? I see them welling up, but they're not coming out. Well, yeah, if you look down, gravity will help. Gravity will help if you look down. You'll get those tears out, girl. You can do it. Now just hide your face so that we can't see that you're not really crying. Absolutely. I really hope at this point that you all aren't out there thinking that I'm unfeeling, because I do have a lot of sympathy and a lot of empathy for abuse victims, which is why I hate to see a bitch using it as an excuse for bullshit behavior. I hate to see a person like Casey Anthony, who in my opinion is lying about this abuse, stand on the hard work, tragedy, and sacrifice of other women who have fought so hard and so long to gain a shred of credibility in this arena. And people like Casey and Amber Heard are going to bring us right back to the dark ages, and I personally refuse to allow that to happen. So every time I see it, I will call it out. Okay, I'm going to say something petty and judgmental right now, so I just want to give you a warning, because around the 45-minute mark in this episode, Casey starts talking about her defense team and how they're still a family and like they love each other and it's all they have is each other. Hold on, I'll show you.
After everything was done with my case, after the trial, long after July of 2011, my defense team, they truly became my family. And we've chosen to still stay banded because we truly do look at one another as not just colleagues and war buddies, but as family and friends. And I love these people so much. Liz, Pat, Dorothy, Caylee. So we are on our way now to Liz's house.
Liz, Pat, Dorothy, Caylee. I don't know these people personally. I don't even know why they're still like in the conversation. It's not important. But I really think, because I'm being petty right now, anyone who is in Casey Anthony's life, who truly believes that they're close to Casey, who believes that Casey cares about them, I feel bad for that person. Either A, these people have never known true love or true human connection, or B, they have their own shit that makes them highly susceptible to a charming, charismatic, enigmatic, but insincere individual. These would be the same type of people that would join a cult and believe that the cult leader cared about them. They'd be the same people to drink the Kool-Aid. If you believe Casey Anthony or your team Casey, you're in a cult. You're part of a collective that conveniently ignores all the real hard evidence and decides instead to focus only on the portions of this case that are just blurry enough to sort of work in Casey's benefit, as long as you don't talk about the opposing viewpoint, kind of like the makers of this series have done. No offense to them. I like the people in the legal team. I know it's bitchy to say, but Casey is so fake, so rehearsed, so insincere. it's really honestly my belief that you cannot get close to Casey. You can't know Casey because Casey doesn't know herself. And this one woman keeps talking about how when she first met Casey, she was stunned by how physically small Casey was, yet there was this strength in Casey, this survival instinct. You know, this little girl, just so tiny and innocent, but inside she's strong. Survival instinct, because like an animal in the wild, Casey will do anything to survive, to come out on top. Hey, some wild animals even eat their own children. Just as a quick nature fun fact, not a jab at Casey or anything, I have to admit I did fast forward a bit at this point because they just brought all of these people from Casey's defense team to talk about what a good person Casey is and how badly she was treated. And it's like, if you could put together a group of more biased individuals, I'm not sure how. They were on her defense team. They were on her side from the beginning. What are they going to say? Casey was a narcissistic child killer who we worked tirelessly to get off? No, they're in it now, man. They got skin in the game. If they come out and say we were wrong, how does it make any of them look? They have to die on this hill with her forever. Oh, and then they talk about how there was an offer, like a plea deal on the table. And the plea deal for Casey from the prosecution was 20 years in the DOC, the Department of Corrections. And then Casey would have to accept guilt and responsibility for Kaylee's death.
Okay, I have to put this part in. I laughed Jose Baez out of the room that we were meeting in, telling him there's no fucking way.
She was not having it. The last thing that she would even entertain is the idea that she would take credit for hurting the only one pure true thing she ever had.
It takes a lot of courage and belief for somebody to, be facing the death penalty and turn down an offer. Casey would have nothing to do with it.
I would rather have been found guilty and spent my life, the rest of my life, on death row, fighting for my life and my innocence, than to have ever pled to something I didn't do.
You knew you could file appeal after appeal.
I wrote those checks.
You knew
I
that.
admitted guilt on each of those. That was it.
You knew you were going to go on death row. You were going to
It was
die.
never a consideration. Ever.
Yo, listening to these people, I feel like I'm in a different dimension. I feel like I'm in a dimension where the general public's IQ has dropped 100 points because that's how they're treating us, like drooling morons. Casey didn't take the deal because she didn't want to go to prison for 20 years. Because she did the math and she was like, shit, I'll be over 40 by the time I'm out. Those are the best years of my life and I'm not willing to sacrifice them. I'm not willing to sit behind bars for one more day, much less 20 years. She knew that if she was found guilty, she could just file appeal after appeal. She knew that she could keep this case tied up in the courts for long enough to avoid the lethal injection, even in the state of Florida, where, yes, they do have more lax death penalty laws. There are more people currently sitting on death row right now than have ever been put to death in the history of the state. And only 2 women have ever been put to death in Florida, the last being Eileen Wuornos in 2002. And she was a serial killer, okay? And I'm sure Casey's lawyer, Jose Baez, was like, this is a good thing for us. The prosecution is going to ask for the death penalty because it's going to be real hard for a jury to look at, tiny, pretty little Casey, in the prime of her years and sentence you to death. They're going to need some real hard evidence before the jury can agree to do that. And I completely am on board with that. That's correct. The prosecution should not have done that. They should not. They did not have enough hard physical evidence to actually ask for the death penalty because any human being is going to have a hard time looking at anybody and, sentencing them to death unless you have literal videotape of this murder happening or real hard evidence. Like, for instance, Eileen Wuornos. I mean, come on. We knew she did it. The next portion that they go into in this episode is the alleged junk science that the prosecution used during the trial, like the duct tape on Kaylee's mouth, the coffin flies in the trunk, the presence of chloroform in the trunk, etc., etc. So I need to stop this video here and continue on in the next one because this video is already long enough and I have a lot to say about this quote-unquote junk science. So we're going to pick up with that and the rest of episode 2, as well as episode 3 next time. Because of the fact that in the docu-series in episode 2, they talk about the junk science in the trial at the end of the episode, and they literally graze over it. They spend about, I think, 10 minutes total talking about the forensics. It's such a condensed, ridiculous really twisted narrative of the forensics in this case that I do need to take the time to set it straight. And then, I'll also watch episode 3. There's just so much to set straight and so much audacity is displayed by everyone who agreed to be a part of this, who agreed to speak out in support of Casey Anthony, that it is going to take some time to wade through the bullshit, but we're going to do it. We only have like 15 minutes of episode 2 left and then the rest of, the whole entirety of episode 3, but we're going to do it. But that is all for today. I think that I have sufficiently gotten myself worked up, and I'm really happy if you stayed through this whole video. I really think that I made a lot of good points. Like, I hate to toot my own horn, but I feel like I made a lot of good points. I feel like I really discredited so many of the things she said in this docuseries. And I've said things that they will never say in this docuseries, that they'll never admit to, because they can't. They can only show one side. They can only show one side, because if you show both sides, then you're going to have to actually give human beings the ability to parse through information and make their own decision. And we can't have human beings making their own decision. We got to have people like Rosie O'Donnell, idiot. That woman's an idiot. Okay, see, I'm pissed off. I'm being petty and mean now. So I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you all so much for being here. I love you so much. The next time we talk, it's probably going to be the new year. So I hope everybody has an amazing holiday. I got to clean my house at some point, but I'm not looking forward to that. Don't forget to check out Surfshark VPN in the description box. Don't forget to check out my coffee, Criminal Coffee Company. It's so good, guys. Really, it gets me through the day. It gives me the energy to continue doing what I need to do to watch these Casey Anthony episodes. Don't forget to check out my coffee, Criminal Coffee Company. Don't forget to check out my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host every week with retired police detective Derek Levasseur. We are actually going through the Kathleen Peterson and Michael Peterson case right now. We just recorded the first part of that last night, so that's going to be up at the end of this week. I'm really excited. It's a great case, so go check that out. Anywhere you get your audio podcast, and we also have a YouTube channel. Both of those things are linked in the description. Thank you so much to my Patreons for loving me, for allowing me to love you, for being there for me through everything, and for really just being the most awesome group of people. I appreciate you guys. Follow me on social media, Instagram and Twitter. Links are in the description box. And until next time, stay safe, stay kind, stay beautiful, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep. The mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name. Better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's killing you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood.